We turn now to look at the nature-nurture argument in Greek philosophy, which could be related to creature covenant thinking in Judaism, and also to the Gentiles or Greeks on the one hand and the Jews on the other in Romans. In other words, these are three different ways of phrasing the same kind of issue. Nature, nurture, meaning simply, do we do what we do because of the way we're made, or do we do what we do because of the way we're raised? Now, that then can relate to the way God created the world on the one hand, and what God requires in his law on the other. And on that point, let me just say that the word nomos, which we always translate as law, could be translated in more of a nurturing understanding. And here's the reason why. Human laws are meant to guide a society. In other words, to nurture a society. And so there is a relationship, even in the Greek language, but also conceptually, between nurture and law. And so nomos can include both. And so when Paul addresses the issue of the plight of humanity in Romans, he does so with language that you also find in Greek philosophy. Physis is the word for nature, and he uses that word in Romans 1. But nomos is the word not only for law, but also for convention, for nurturing in Greek philosophy. So what I'm going to suggest is that what Paul does is he constructs his discussion of the plight of humanity in Romans 1 through 3 in terms of a very common Greek philosophical debate. And that debate was also held by the Romans, but it starts several hundred years before Paul. And the debate is the debate of whether we do what we do because of physis, or nature, the way God has made us, or do we do it because of the culture in which we live and the laws that apply in that culture? Paul's answer is going to be a bit different from what was expected as the answers in Greek philosophy. Because what Paul's going to say is that neither nature nor the nurturing law lead us to righteousness, but both fail. And both fail to such an extent that only a righteousness from God can rectify the situation. This is Paul's first argument in Romans. Nature, the way things are, is obviously related to creation. And so where Greeks and Romans might talk about nature, the Jews might just as well talk about creation and God as creator. Similarly, on the nurturing side, where the Greeks and Romans might talk about nurture and the way in which a community is shaped because of its laws and its customs, for example. On the Jewish side, the discussion would be about the law and God's covenant relationship with his people. So nature and nurture on the Greek and Roman side relate to the Jewish discussion of creation and the law. Now, N.T. Wright, in a book in 2005 called Paul in Fresh Perspective, points out that Paul often thinks about the nature, nurture, or creation law concept, the relationship between the two. God is, after all, the creator and the lawgiver. And Christology as well fits into this. For example, in a later book, later than Romans, in Colossians, we read in Colossians 1:15 through 17 about Jesus as the one involved in creation. He's the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, for by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And then in the next three verses, 18, 19, and 20, Paul turns to the other side to talk about Jesus in his relationship with his people. And this is a nurture or a covenant relationship in mind. And he is the head of the body, the church, and he is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. And then also, Wright points out that we have creation and covenant arguments that run through Romans 1 through 11. He says what I am arguing also, that Romans 1:18 through 2:16 deals with God's good creation. We just have to add, and also God's universal law. And then chapter 2, 17 through 29 he has. You could take it all the way to 3:9. The focus is on Israel's special law, the law through Moses that God makes. God reveals to Israel through Moses when he makes his covenant with his people. And then in chapter 4, Wright says that Genesis 15 is in view with respect to the covenant being fulfilled in Christ. And so he says that in 4:18 through 21, there is then a reversal of what we read in Romans 1 about the creation. So there's covenant and creation in chapter 4, but in a different order. And then in 5 through 8, chapters 5 through 8, creation and covenant themes are developed. In chapter 5, the Adam Christology, in verses 12 to 21, appears. That's a creation kind of argument. But in Romans 7, the focus is on the law, the covenant. Now, within that, Paul again appeals in verses, in the first part of the 7:7 passage and following. The first part has creation in view, but the second part has the law in view, and people divide those differently, which is why the verses are either 12 or 13, or in the division between the creation and the law in Romans 7. And so the point here is that Paul seems to follow through a twofold perspective in Romans on creation and covenant. The twofold approach to arguing in Romans that Wright points out continues in chapter 8. The problem with the law of Romans 7 is answered in Romans chapter 8 as Paul looks to a new creation that comes through Jesus and the Spirit. The Torah is weak from the flesh and has failed, Romans 8, 3-4, but the new creation that comes through Jesus and the Spirit accomplishes what God wants to accomplish in terms of the righteousness of his people. As we move into Romans chapters 10 and 11, we can continue to see the relationship between covenant and creation, covenant renewal and the created order being reclaimed. Now, already in Deuteronomy 30, the idea that something would follow God's judgment on his sinful people is expressed. And it's expressed in terms of covenant renewal, the return from exile and restoration of Israel. And this is partly in view in Romans 9 through 11. Yet Romans 9 through 11 is also about the inclusion of the Gentiles as part of God's plan for renewing his people. And so it extends beyond the covenant people themselves to have in view a restoration of the created order. Some Jewish texts also have a broader vision of reclaiming the created order, a broader vision than just covenant renewal for Israel herself. In Baruch, or the Qumran document 4Q-MMT, for example, instead of Israel returning from exile, the texts speak of the message going out to all people. And Psalm 19 also talks about how the sound has gone out to the whole world, words to the end of the earth. And this outward expansion of the message is related directly to the Christian understanding of the early church's mission as they go out to the nations. Now they go out in part to restore the rest of Israel from captivity and bring them back, but with them come the nations. And so you not only have covenant renewal, but you have a reclaiming of the created order. And then it's important to point out that this whole section, Romans 9 through 11, ends with the creation renewal. In Romans 11:32 to 36, the praise that Paul breaks into is a praise that God has not simply dealt with his people Israel, but all peoples, and his plan relates to the renewal of all creation. As we look back to the initial argument in Romans, we can see that the issue of creation and nature is taken up in 1:18 through 32. The discussion in 2:1 through 16 has in view God's law, and largely God's law understood as divine law, although already interjected into this section is some understanding of the Mosaic law as well. But as we get into verse 17 of chapter 2 and take it right on through the end of the argument, the Jews are in focus with their specific law for their nation, the law revealed to Moses. And then the conclusion comes in Romans 3:9. What then? Are we any better off? No, not at all. For we have already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under the power of sin. That's Paul's conclusion that he then establishes with his catena of scripture quotations in 3:10 through 18. We find that what Paul says about a creation ordinance, a divine law of God that applies to all of creation, is something that was also said in Greco-Roman philosophy, and in particular the Stoics. Epictetus speaks of the divine and mighty and inescapable law. He says that God administers the universe, and Epictetus speaks of the law of nature. Epictetus in his discourses says, "But for us, to whom God has given also the faculty of understanding, these things related to bodily needs are not sufficient, for unless we act in a proper and orderly manner and conformably to the nature and constitution of each thing, we shall never attain our true end." And notice the language there of nature, physis. The same language is used in Romans 1 by Paul. Later, Epictetus says, "But convince me of this, that you acted naturally, and I will convince you that everything which takes place according to nature takes place rightly." The argument here is that you can derive an ethic from nature. The way things are is an argument for how they should be. And he says, man is a rational and mortal being. Epictetus also has the idea of innate ideas in a person, what we would call a conscience, and what Paul calls a conscience in Romans 2. He says, but as to good and evil and beautiful and ugly and becoming and unbecoming and happiness and misfortune and proper and improper and what we ought to do and what we ought not to do, whoever came into the world without having an innate idea of them. Again, he has this idea of what is conformable to nature. He says, but if you say to a man, your desires are inflamed, your aversions are low, your intentions are inconsistent, your pursuits are not conformable to nature, your opinions are rash and false, the man immediately goes away and says, he has insulted me. The idea here being that people want to be considered as people who live in an appropriate way, in a conformable way to nature. Now in Romans 1:28, Paul says, and since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind and to things that should not be done. And here the word nous is used for mind, and it appears again in Romans 12, verse 2, where Paul picks up the ethical section of Romans after his long theological argument through chapter 11. And so Paul says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So if the mind has become debased as it is turned away from what God has written in creation itself, in Romans chapter 1, now it is possible, in light of what God has accomplished in Jesus Christ, for people to be transformed by the renewing of their minds. And if in Romans 1, people's minds are such that they no longer know what God's will is, and in fact think that things like idolatry or homosexuality are actually natural, now, through Christ, it is possible to know the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Now, the nature and nurture distinction in Greek thought seems to be at root in Romans. Nomos, as I said earlier, can be translated as custom or law. That is, what is written, codified law of a certain people. And discussion of religion turned on whether gods existed by physis, that would be by nature or in reality, or only by nomos, of political organization, on whether states arose by divine ordinance, by natural necessity, or by nomos, of cosmopolitanism, on whether divisions within the human race are natural or only a matter of nomos, of equality, on whether the rule of one man over another, like slavery, or one nation over another, that is empire, is natural and inevitable, or only by convention, by nomos, by custom, and so on, says Guthrie in A History of Greek Philosophy. In classical Greece, in the 4th century BC, the debate was on between those who argued that virtue comes from within and therefore has to do with how you are made and created, and the other argument being that virtue can be taught. Plato, for example, in a work engaging Protagoras, has Socrates voice the doubt that virtue can be taught, whereas Protagoras argues that teaching needs both nature and practice. And here practice is related then to the nurturing. The Greek word is askesis, meaning practice and training and exercise. Guthrie then gives some quotations to illustrate the point. The point is that nomos requires a mind that devises the law, but such a mind could be that of the gods. Thus there are universal laws of the gods on the one hand, and human laws that differ from society to society. Heraclitus, an early Greek philosopher, said human laws, nomoi, are sustained by one divine law. And Hesiod said that Zeus laid down a law for all men. Thucydides said politicians of his day do not observe the divine law. And Sophocles spoke of unwritten laws that are divine, everlasting, and cannot be defied by mortals. Plato says in a work called Laws that the laws of Crete were given by Zeus and those of Sparta by Apollo. Here's an attempt to tie the laws of a people to a god, just as with Moses we have the law for Israel tied to what God himself has said. Sophocles says the laws governing religious purity were given by Olympus, the gods, because Olympus is where the gods dwell, not by any human nature. And Isocrates says that leaving the dead unburied is spurning the ancient custom, and here the word ethos, not nomos, is used, and ancestral nomos. You can see the relationship between ethos and nomos, which all men observe as not laid down by men, but ordained by divine power. In his work on rhetoric, Aristotle says the following, and this is actually a very interesting quote for what we're talking about, but also note that he uses the language that Paul uses in Romans regarding what is dikaios, what is right or just or righteous. He says, let us now classify just, dikaiomata, and unjust actions generally, starting from what follows. Justice, dikaia, and injustice have been defined in reference to laws, namus, and persons in two ways. Now there are two kinds of law, particular and general. By particular laws, I mean those established by each people in reference to themselves, which again are divided into written and unwritten. By general laws, I mean those based upon nature, kataphusin. In fact, there is a general idea of just, dikaion, and unjust, adikon, in accordance with nature, phusei, as all men in a manner divine, even if there is neither communication nor agreement between them. So here we have these ideas of what's natural, two kinds of law, the universal and the particular law, the particular laws of a certain people, and also what is just, dikaios, justification, dikaiosune in Paul. This way of thinking, this way of talking, is not just a theological language, but also something that would have been known in Greek intellectual thought, Aristotle coming 300 years before Paul. Now there's thought to be a problem with nature, though. Demosthenes says, the whole life of men, by their city, great or small, is governed by nature and by laws. There's our distinction again. He says, of these two, nature is disorderly and varies with the individual, whereas the laws are common, agreed, and the same for all. Nature may be corrupt and often has base desires, and men with such a nature will be found doing wrong. But the laws aim at what is just, good, and beneficial. This they seek, and when it is found, it is published as a common injunction, applying equally and impartially to all. So there are many reasons why it should be obeyed by all, and in especial because it is a discovery and gift of the gods, decided on by men of wisdom, the corrector of faults both voluntary and involuntary, and established by common agreements of the city, as that by which every citizen should regulate his life. Remove the laws, give every man license to do what he will, and not only is the Constitution abolished, but life itself is reduced to the level of the beasts. So here is a defense of laws that societies come up with to help deal with the corruption of what is natural because of the base desires that human beings have. And Paul's take on this is, yes, that's true. There has been a corruption of nature, but also that corruption in man, that sin, is such that they also cannot follow the law. And as we have here in bold, Paul will say in Romans chapter 7 that the law is holy, just, and good. Two of the words that Demosthenes himself uses to describe laws. But Paul's whole point is that the problem with the law is that it is impotent to make unrighteous people righteous.